Its own president calls it an epidemic of violence. This time 4 dead in a mass killing and 8 others injured after a gunman drove a vehicle into this church in Michigan. He opened fire before setting it alight with gasoline. Hundreds of people were inside at the time, worshipping at the Mormon Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Seen here, the pickup truck used, complete with the stars and stripes, and a place of worship, now a wreckage.
Our thoughts and prayers go out to the victims of this incident that could have been completely avoided. And it's very tragic, and that's not what our community is. I'd also like to acknowledge the heroism of not only the first responders, but the people who were inside that church at the time. They were shielding the children who were also present within the church, moving them to safety. Just hundreds of people just practicing their faith. Just extreme courage, brave, and that's the type of community that we are.
The gunman has been identified as Thomas Jacob Sanford, a former US Marine from a nearby town and believed to be a veteran of the Iraq War. He was killed in the shootout with police, who were on the scene within less than a minute. They say suspected explosives were also found. Authorities are investigating the incident but say the motive remains unclear. The FBI now providing federal assistance, calling it an act of targeted violence. Police have now upped resources to religious institutions across the country. On social media, Donald Trump said it appeared to be yet another targeted attack on Christians in the United States of America, saying that the epidemic of violence in the US must end immediately. And the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, said her heart was breaking, adding that violence, especially in a place of worship, is unacceptable. This incident happened here in the Midwest, around 100 kilometers north of Detroit, and centered on a Mormon church. The Gun Violence Archive shows that over the past 5 years, the number of mass shootings in the US has increased. Mass shootings are considered as 4 people or more killed, not including the shooter. And according to Johns Hopkins University, in recent years there's been an average of 1 death by firearm violence every 11 minutes in the US.
I know there had been some church shootings like recently in the news, but like the fact that my hands are shaking, like it's 10 minutes down the road from where I live, my home. That's insane. Like, I don't know what the hell is going on.
This is part of living in America now, and however it may seem to those outside, in a country that has more guns than people, this has become the reality. Each act of unrelenting violence, no less devastating. Well, joining me now is Professor Cliona Raleigh. She's the CEO and founder of ACLED. It's a think tank providing real-time data and analysis on violent conflict across the world. She's also a professor of political violence. Professor, we don't have a motive at the moment, but we do know that the shooter was a veteran of the Iraq War. There's been another shooting over the weekend at a bar in North Carolina as well, in which an Iraq War veteran was arrested in connection with it. What does your data show regarding veterans in particular?
Thanks very much for the question. There's no particular pattern about veteran violence, especially mass violence like we've seen over this weekend. Of course, this weekend in the US was especially violent in many places. And in fact, up to this year, it's looking like it's going to be similar to last year in terms of the amount of gun violence in the States, which is already at an all-time high.
If we look at the last 5 years, there appears to have been an increase in gun violence compared with, say, before the pandemic, especially when we look at mass shootings. What does your research show there? And are there any clear indicators as to why?
So in 2019, there was an already very high rate of gun violence in the States, of course, but 2020 saw a drastic increase, and that increase went up a little in 2021 and 2022 before going back to 2020 levels for the remainder of this time. And this year is set to be equal to last year, as I mentioned. But this increase in the last 5 years or so is somewhat unprecedented. And of course, what's really strange is that it mirrors the rise in global political violence. Now, of course, the domestic US gun violence is not related to global political violence in any particular way, but it's interesting that they both increased, of course, during and then post-COVID. And there really is very few explanations that can explain both at the same time. But I would say in the US, it certainly has something to do with the amount of security, public security in the policing that occurred during that time.
This is also a uniquely American phenomenon, isn't it? But there are geographic elements to this as well within the US. What is it that you found?
Yeah, that's a very good point because lone wolf violence, which is what a lot of these killings are, that don't occur in the high crime hotspots of Chicago, DC, Albuquerque. So if we separate just the general crime that is, of course, relatively high in the US, especially gun crime, and we look at, for example, lone wolf crime, what we're seeing is that there is occurrences across the US, but we're seeing a concentration at the moment within the Midwest, within Michigan, within Minneapolis, and of course, Minnesota more broadly. But for the militias that also are very prolific within the US, although they have a relatively low activity rate, those are much more prevalent in Arizona and Montana than they are in the other parts.
To what extent is politics playing a role in all of this, whether it be polarizing communities, both shootings, and also the aftermath and how they think they should be dealt with as well? Is that all part of it?
A little bit. The lone wolf violence is often taken as a an excuse for different political parties to lob assaults at each other. Whereas, of course, these types of shooters do not have any sort of partisan inclination. They're not representing a political agenda. They may be stimulated by a particular political belief, but that's not mapped onto the US political system in any meaningful way. And so that's why, really, after Charlie Kirk's killing, we've seen an explosion of political commentary about what is effectively an individual's political belief, and there's not a huge amount of coherence there.
You mentioned recent events, but have lone wolf attacks been the norm since data began, or are they becoming more common recently?
So I would say they're not necessarily becoming more common because if you will recall, in the last decade or so, or maybe even 2 decades, really, since these attacks were recorded as happening a lot in schools, they've started to become more common in grocery stores or in places of worship, places that we would have considered to be relatively safe. So the most recent ones that have occurred have had an unfortunate and, of course, tragic consequence of them happening a lot in places of worship.
Do we know why? What the reason is?
I think that there's a little bit of one-upmanship with some of these lone wolf attacks. So while I certainly ascribe to the idea that everybody who perpetrates these types of attacks are suffering from a very severe mental breakdown, their choice of where to attack these places can seem extremely random. And one of the reasons they seem both random and somewhat inevitable is that there isn't a pattern so much as a clear draw to gaining the most publicity, or, for example, going after unprotected populations, whether they are children praying in Minneapolis or, of course, Mormon worshippers in this quite small place in Michigan.
There were new gun safety laws that came into some states a couple of years ago, but there's never been these huge strides forward that some have wanted. So how successful is previous legislation seen in the US on both sides of the debate?
It's interesting because after the Charlie Kirk killing, there was very, very little discussion of gun control laws, when, of course, the things that are leading to these, whether it's crime or lone wolves or militia behavior, all of these underlying either societal or political motivations are common in every country. Every country seems relatively polarized at the moment. But rather than thinking about how in the US there's very, very few obstacles to creating mass violence, and in other countries there are many, many obstacles, those obstacles in the US have been dismantled, and they were gun control laws. However, if some states pass gun control laws, that almost has no effect on the availability or the use of those guns because you can simply go elsewhere to get them.
Professor Clina Raleigh, thank you very much.
Thank you.